Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session, Semantics II, Part 1. My name is Masha Yasipova, and I will be moderating this session. We have 3 talks today, 20 minutes each, with 10 minutes for Q&A. So for Q&A, if you have a question, you can type it into the chat or into the Q&A. Or if you prefer to ask the question vocally, you can indicate so in the chat or in the Q&A. And when we get to you, I will unmute you. You will be able to ask your question, and then you will be remuted. After the 3 talks and Q&As are done, this Zoom room will close, and it will reopen again for the next session. Okay? So without further ado, our first speakers are Corey Bill and Toda Koyev, both are from University of Constance. And they will be talking about, the topic of the talk is Verum focus is Verum, but not always focus. My understanding is that Toda will be giving the talk. Toda, would you like to share your slides?
Yeah.
In the meantime, I'm going to reshare the message that you sent in the chat with the link to the slides. There you go.
Okay, can I start? Yeah. Okay. Placing a pitch accent on the finite auxiliary in English emphasizes the truth of the prejacent. An example of that is given in 1. Oliver is from Australia seems to convey something close to, it is true that Oliver is from Australia. We call this phenomenon Verum accent. We try not to use the more common term Verum focus because, as you will see, we'll argue that it does not necessarily involve focus. There are 2 major analyses of Verum accent. One analysis says that Verum accent is just focus on a syntactically represented polarity head. Another analysis says that Verum accent is the spelling out of an otherwise covert epistemic / common ground operator. This approach comes in 2 flavors, those of Romero and Hahn 2004 and Guzman et al. 2020. We'll talk more about these at the end of the talk. And we'll be siding with the operator approach. Okay, so anticipating a bit, here is our core proposal. We claim that Verum accent spells out a Verum operator that has no truth conditional import, but introduces a conflicting evidence presupposition. This is illustrated in 2. So Verum P amounts to P, provided that there is conflicting evidence about P. Additionally, we do not deny that polarity focus exists. We only claim that polarity focus is independent from Verum accent. We propose that polarity focus is generated when a pitch accent is placed on a lexical polar element, such as negation, epistemic really, or Verum itself. Notice the word lexical here. So there seems to be some tension between saying that polarity focus is focused on syntactic head versus being focused on a lexical material that's already out there. It seems that the 2 accounts make slightly different predictions. In terms of empirical coverage, we'll talk about Verum accent in declaratives, and we'll also talk about polarity focus in declaratives and questions. We'll be talking about questions, polar questions with a Verum accent or Verum questions, polar questions with epistemic really or really questions, and negative polar questions. Here's the outline. First, we'll be presenting our analysis of Verum. Then we'll be talking about polarity focus and question bias. Then we'll see 1 example where in our account, Verum and polarity focus co-occur. And finally, we'll briefly talk about prior accounts of Verum accent. Okay, It has been noticed in the literature that VRAM accent occurs in two main contexts, contradiction and affirmation contexts. A contradiction context is as in 3, Oliver is not from Australia. No, he is from Australia. Here, there is a contradiction, or A and B speaker in here disagree. Affirmation context is one where speaker in here do agree. Paulo is an amazing linguist. Says A and B replies, yes, she is an amazing linguist. A VRAM accent is infelicitous in a neutral context, such as 5. If A asks a neutral question along the lines of, is it raining? B cannot just say, it is raining. Importantly, what we mean by neutral question is not necessarily an out of the blue context. What we mean is that a context that has no conflict about the prejacent. Okay, so here is our analysis. We analyze VRAM accent as the overt manifestation of an epistemic VRAM operator. As just said, this operator has no truth conditional import, but presupposes the existence of conflicting evidence about the prejacent. The rule in 6 is restated from above. The question here is, what is conflicting evidence? I will be not too specific about this, but we'll say something like conflicting evidence about P involves two pieces of evidence about P that are incompatible or contradictory, in the sense that they cannot both be true at the same time. We'll show that this very simple semantics actually now show that it derives the distribution of VRAM accent in the various contexts that we just mentioned. Okay. First, VRAM in contradiction context. The example 7 is restated from above. Oliver is not from Australia. No, he is from Australia. Here, the conflicting evidence presupposition is clearly satisfied. So VRAM accent, which signals the presence of VRAM, is felicitous. The evidence against the prejacent comes from A's initial utterance, which is a negative one. The evidence for the prejacent comes perhaps from yet the previous utterance, in the sense that A's negative sentence is perhaps or is interpreted as a reaction to a prior positive claim. Or in certain cases, it's possible that we can accommodate the evidence that comes with the norm of assertion coming from B's utterance itself. VRAM in affirmation context is a bit trickier. So the example that we used is recited again in 8. Paulo is an amazing linguist. Says A and B answer, she is an amazing linguist. What is going on here? Because obviously there doesn't seem to be a clear disagreement. What you notice here is that such context, especially the example in 8, involve what is called an extreme adjective, something like amazing. Such adjectives make use of the far end of the scale of the respective regular adjective, in this case, good. Extreme adjectives create an implicit contradiction in the following sense. The evidence for the prejacent clearly comes from A's utterance that Paulo is an amazing linguist. Where do we get the negative evidence? We just need to walk 2 steps forward, and we can get a contradiction in the following sense. If we assume that good and amazing form a Horn scale, we can say that A's utterance naturally evokes the respective good alternative, namely Paulo is a good linguist. And now if we allow in a second step to strengthen this to Paulo is a good but not an amazing linguist, we get evidence against the prejacent. The 2 scales that good but not amazing and amazing operate are don't overlap. So we get an implicit contradiction here. So this is our explanation for affirmation context. In a sense, they are a special case of a contradiction context. The contradiction is stated a bit more obliquely. Okay, neutral context, the derivation is clear. There is no conflict here, so VRAM is not licensed. There is not much to say here. A VRAM accent may occur not only in declaratives, but also in polar questions. VRAM questions have been claimed to convey a negative speaker bias. For example, if you hear, did Carl kick the dog with a pitch accent on did, you'll probably imply that or infer that the speaker doubts that Carl kicked the dog. However, it has also been noticed that VRAM questions are not necessarily biased. This is could be or can be diagnosed with the neutrality marker by any chance, which is not compatible with any kind of bias and only occurs in unbiased questions. So you can say something like, by any chance, did Carl kick the dog? Because some say he did, others say he didn't. The conflict here is explicitly stated, and you'll notice that the conflicting evidence presupposition does not derive a bias. So what is going on? Why do we get the intuition intent that bias could be present? We'll claim that when bias is present, there is polarity focus on theorem. Okay, before we talked about polarity focus, this is a quick refresher on Ruth's alternative semantics for focus, which we'll adopt. Every linguistic expression alpha has an ordinary and a focus semantic value. When alpha is not focused, the focus semantic value is the singleton set comprised of the ordinary meaning of alpha. When alpha is focused, then the focus semantic value is comprised of all alternative objects of the same semantic type, and they are special compositional rules that apply in pointwise fashion to compose complex expressions. More generally, focus can be semantic or pragmatic. Pragmatic focus can be presentational or contrastive. This has been formalized in Ruth's work in the following way. So we'll write things like phi tilde or squiggle, as it's called in the field, Q, or phi squiggle P. Presentational focus roughly means that the focus domain phi is congruent or isomorphic, roughly speaking, to the Q, which is in this case is the question under discussion. So this is this first condition here. There are a couple more conditions, but they are not so important. With contrastive focus, the focus antecedent P is a proposition, not a question anymore. And in this case, what we're contrasting is P and the ordinary value of phi. And of course, P and phi have to have something in common, so they're not like completely different. So P has to be a member of the focus semantic value of phi. So what is polarity focus? Given that background, polarity focus for us is regular focus marking on a lexical polar element. A polar element is things like negation, epistemic, really, emphatic, so, definitely, etc. So those are elements that determine the polarity of a sentence in the sense that they entail the predjacent of its negation. Crucially, we assume that when such an element is in focus, its focus semantic value includes both polar values. So this is shown in 12b. So focus so or focus no, not, their focus semantic values includes the identity function on propositions, or a function that takes a proposition and returns its negation. Polarity focus can be interpreted presentationally or contrastively. A presentational interpretation arises in cases where both alternatives are present in the antecedent question. So they ask, did Sarah pass the test? And you answer, no, she did not pass the test. We focus on not. In this case, the focus domain is the predjacent, the minimal clause, which contains the focus, and the antecedent is the QD. And if you compute the values, you'll see that the QD and the focus semantic value of the focus domain are equivalent. So this meets the conditions for presentation of focus. In a contrastive focus interpretation, an antecedent of the opposite polarity is present, as in 14. I thought Sarah passed, but she did not pass. Again, we have this LF here with the squiggle operator and required antecedent. What is going on here is that there is a contrast between the positive proposition that Sarah passed, P, and the negative proposition, which is the ordinary semantic value of the focus domain. Okay, now we come to bias. So it's well known that questions containing accented or high negation have been associated with a positive bias. So if you hear something like, did Jane not win, or didn't Jane win, you will conclude that the speaker believes that, or the speaker finds it more likely that she won. This can be derived by assuming that there is contrastive focus, or there is contrastive focus where the focus domain is just the question predjacent. Notice that the presentational interpretation here would be redundant. It would just repeat the regular question partition, win, not win. A contrastive interpretation, however, is possible. And again, we're contrasting here the antecedent Jane1 to the ordinary semantic value of the focus domain, marked as phi here, which is that she did not win. Okay, we assume that the production of a question with such a presupposition generates the sense that the speaker favors the positive question alternative. So in a sense, the speaker is pointing at an existing alternative and asking whether the negative alternative is also true. From this, you can conclude that the speaker believes that or is biased towards the focus antecedent. We can analyze polarity focus in positive questions in a similar way. For example, questions with really, does Susan really drink? The derivation is similar, except that here the focus domain is corresponds to a positive proposition. So the antecedent needs to be a negative one, and this is why we get negative bias. Now we come back to VRAM questions and the interesting data where sometimes you seem to have bias, sometimes not. So we assume that the neutral interpretation is generated when VRAM is unfocused. So if you have something like by any chance, did Carl kick the dog? Because some say he did, others say he didn't. What we have here is just VRAM. And what we generate here is a presupposition that takes care of the occurrence in different contexts. But how come sometimes we do get bias? In that case, we assume that VRAM is itself focused. And so we can derive bias in the same way through polarity focus as we did with really. So VRAM is a positive element, and so the bias here is negative. Okay, in the last few minutes of this talk, we'll briefly mention 3 previous accounts of VRAM accent. According to Goods-Hughes 2018 account, VRAM accent is polarity focused, or on his view, focused on a syntactically represented polarity head. This approach can straightforwardly capture the felicity of VRAM accent in contradiction and affirmation context. We don't have time to go over this, but you can probably imagine how this would go. However, as far as we can tell, it struggles to explain why VRAM accent is infelicitous in neutral context. And especially notice the contrast in 19. If there is a neutral question, did Sarah pass the test yesterday? You cannot answer it by saying, yes, she did pass the test in the absence of prior conflict, but you can answer it by saying, no, she did not pass the test. There is not, there are ways to go here, however, in order to explain this contrast and especially the infelicity in 19b, the account would need to stipulate that first, polarity focus is always contrastive. And second, we could also say that only the pronounced question alternative can serve as a focus antecedent. If you make those 2 assumptions, you can say that 19b is infelicitous because there is no salient negative antecedent, but 19b prime is felicitous because there is a salient positive antecedent. Romero and Han 2004 is a very different account. In their view, VRAM accent signals the presence of a meta-conversational operator conveying certainty that the prejacent P should be added to the common ground. We can just write for this for sure in the common ground P. This account comes coupled with the assumption that you perform such a meta-conversational move only if there is an epistemic conflict. And this is why such an account can derive the contradiction, affirmation, and neutral context distribution of VRAM accent. However, this account does not explain the existence of unbiased VRAM questions. In fact, according to this account, VRAM questions and questions with polar really are equivalent. They have equivalent logical forms, but this incorrectly predicts that they have the same distribution. In actual fact, really questions are obligatorily biased, VRAM questions are not. And second, this account does not predict the lack of modality in answers to VRAM questions. So if you hear a question like did Carl kick the dog with a pitch accent on did, and the answer is just no, you would infer that Carl did not kick the dog, so just a plain negative proposition. You would not necessarily infer that something like I'm not sure that P should be added to the common ground. This is way too weak and perhaps just wrong. Finally, Gutzman et al. 2020 claimed that Virum accent conveys the following use condition. Virum P equals P, provided that the speaker wants to prevent that the question under discussion is downdated with not P. If you don't know what the use condition is, you can just think presupposition. If you don't know what downdate is, as I don't, you can just plug in update. Okay. This account can explain the distribution of Virum accent in contradiction, affirmation, and neutral contexts because of the stated contradiction in the use condition of the Virum operator. However, it struggles to capture the bias property of Virum questions. Without additional machinery, the account incorrectly predicts a positive bias. This is because the speaker of Virum P is actually pushing against not P. So you can conclude that the speaker actually finds P more likely, or the speaker believes P. In actual fact, Virum questions, however, are negatively biased and not positively biased. It is also unclear on this account how we can derive the fact that Virum questions are biased sometimes, but they are not always biased. In summary, our main claim is that Virum accent and polarity focus are independent phenomena. This has been argued cross-linguistically in Gutzman et al. 2020. We view Virum accent as the overt manifestation of a presupposed Virum operator. Polarity focus, in turn, is narrow focused on a lexical polar element. And we have seen how the two phenomena or two structures can overlap and with each contributing to the final meaning, especially visible in the case of Virum questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We will now open the Q&A. Once again, if you have a question, please type it into the chat or into the Q&A. If you prefer to ask your question vocally, please indicate so in the chat or in the Q&A. Please do not use the raise hand function because it's hard to keep track of the order in which the hands are raised, although I see one raised hand already. Lawrence Horn can ask their question. I will allow you to talk now. You can unmute yourself.
How about now? Yes.
Yes.
So thanks. That was really interesting. I was convinced by your analysis on the kinds of data that you covered. I was wondering if you had thought of extending it to cases in which you have neither simple contradiction nor affirmation Virum accent, but we're dealing with cases that we can call concession affirmation structure. So these are cases like Oliver isn't from Australia, but he is from New Zealand, or I don't have 3 children, but I do have 2. Where we have Virum accent on the auxiliary combined with a fall rise contour, or it's been analyzed in various different ways with a rise at the end. It seems as though in these cases we do have Virum accent, but it doesn't fit into the simple categories that you were presenting.
So one very simple answer to that would be that there is a conflict in the sense that the evidence for the prejacent comes from the assertion itself. So from the second part of the sentence, so Oliver is not from Australia, he is from New Zealand, right?
Right.
And so if you allow that the norm of assertion, which comes with strong evidence in order to claim something or assert something, and then you couple this with the first part of the sentence, I think you could get a contradiction. The question is how much you want to allow. So that would be a case of accommodation, given that the meaning of Virum is a presupposition on our account.
Right. It's natural to think of these in terms of an inability to satisfy the question under discussion and at the same time, a desire to respond to a weaker scalar alternative. In some cases, the scale is obvious. In other cases, like the Australia versus New Zealand, it makes sense only with respect to the question under discussion, because neither, coming from Australia doesn't entail coming from New Zealand, or vice versa. The way I don't have 3 children, but I do have 2 could be taken. But using the question under discussion approach, it kind of makes sense that this is an affirmation, but not an affirmation, not a complete affirmation. So I don't know if you don't need to say anything else if you don't have anything else to say about that. You might not agree.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting example. We have to think more about that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Unless the speakers want to add to that, should we go to the next question? Okay.
Unless someone wants to say something. Yeah. Okay.
No. I think that was what I was thinking.
Okay. Our next question is from Sophia Malamud. Let me find you and let you talk. There you go. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. So I have a very brief comment, which is that the latest version of Romero's account has the identity function for the at issue content of Virum, so that when you answer no, that's not a problem, because the not for sure part is moved to the not at issue dimension, so to speak. My question is a kind of a data question. So can you tell us more about how you were gathering the various Felicity judgments? I mean, as not being a native speaker of English, I can't, profess any judgments, but I was just wondering about, I think it was 19 or one of those that was where B was in, here. It didn't strike me as infelicitous, but maybe I'm constructing some context in my head that accommodates things.
Yeah, I mean, most of the judgments are coming from me. I'm a native, Australian English speaker anyway. And I mean, yeah, I mean, a lot of these are things that I think there are certain judgments that probably need to be looked at more systematically. I think this one in 19b, what we would want to say here is that there's at the very least a contrast between 19b and 19b prime, in the sense that in 19b, that for that to be felicitous, there's a sense in which the speaker perhaps doubted in some sense that Sarah would have passed the test.
Did Sarah pass the test yesterday? Yes, she did pass the test.
Yes, she did pass the test. As opposed to B prime, where it seems, well, at least my judgment is that seemed to me that there doesn't need to be, like, that can just be no, she did not pass the test. She did not pass the test.
Right, so it's a difference, not perhaps in felicity, but in the expressed meaning, in that 19b expresses something like, you shouldn't have doubted, or something like that, or don't even dare doubt.
Yeah, that's right. So we're kind of, and again, maybe we could express this better, but the idea is that 19a is supposed to be a neutral context, in the sense that that the speaker is supposed to have no prior opinion about Sarah's likelihood of passing the test. And if you assume that state of mind, then that's where we're saying the clash occurs, essentially, here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Thank you.
So Danielle says they have a question. If it's a very brief question, ask it. If not, we'll move on to the next speaker.
Okay, it's very brief. It was a nice talk, and I want to think about it a lot more. One thing I'm wondering about in particular is your account of polarity focus. You're using both presentational focus and contrastive focus. Does that potentially predict then that you should actually see polarity focus in replies to polar questions, because the polar question denotes a set of propositions that would be the antecedent for polarity focus in the answer? This is something I ran up against in my own work, which, as you know, is a pure polarity focus account. I just wanted to put that out there for you to, maybe you have something to say or for you to think about.
Isn't that the example in 13, the exact what we have here?
Yeah.
So the example in 13 is supposed to show that you meet the conditions on presentational focus. So presentational focus interpretation, given the theory, should be possible.
Right, but also with a positive answer, right? We were just talking about that example, and
yeah,
you want to claim that it's not necessarily felicitous, but actually, like, if you think focus marking introduces a presupposition, then whatever pressure there is to force people to mark focus and reply to questions, you might expect polarity focus to be required in a positive answer to a polar question on that view.
Yeah, no, that's right. And like that is something we've been thinking about. I'm not sure if we've quite figured out what to do with it exactly. But one of the things we've been playing with is that, so we're kind of claiming here that with negation, you can see it. It can occur on negation. And it doesn't seem to have these effects. Now you might think, oh well, then as we're kind of analysing these positive, like we're identifying like really as a possible positive marker. If you might expect that also to be able to appear in that same way, and so we do need to do. That's something we do need to do something about. And one possibility we've been playing with is that these positive elements, that they all add something extra to the beyond kind of this polarity, them being a polarity element. And it's the fact that they add, and so in some sense, there's no actual direct, you might say, counterpart for negation. There's no positive direct counterpart that can kind of be focused in the same way that negation can. At least that's something we're playing with, but it's something we need to work on a bit more, I think.
Yeah,
that's a good question.
So the point is that there is no positive counterpart where the at issue meaning or the regular meaning is just the identity function on presupposition, and then everything else comes just from polarity focus. We haven't found one. People thought that that's just Viram accent, but we actually argue against that because we seem to find various effects that shouldn't be there. Sorry.
We have to move on. Thank you so much, Toto. Corey, there was some subsequent discussion in the chat. Take a look at those comments. Okay, our next speaker is Daniel Goodhue from University of Maryland. And the topic is a unified account of inquisitive and assertive rising declaratives. Toto, could you unshare your slides? Okay, Daniel, we can see your slides and the floor is yours.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me just try to move this. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. This is sorry, there's a thing blocking my notes here. This is a new project for me. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments in the Q&A. Okay. So first, I'm going to give a brief introduction here. So consider this classic example of a rising declarative in 1A. So the context here is that S is in her office and A has just arrived holding a wet umbrella and a wet raincoat. And then S says, hey, it's raining. This is perfectly felicitous. It poses a question about whether or not it's raining. And you could also use a polar interrogative as in 1B here. Hey, is it raining? Now consider 2, where the context is slightly different. S is in her office, A has just arrived and exhibits no evidence whatsoever about the weather outside. And then S says, hey, it's raining. So this is emphasis in this context, whereas the polar interrogative is again perfectly fine. Hey, is it raining? Only the polar interrogative is felicitous. This suggests that the felicity of rising declaratives depends on the contextual evidence in favor of the proposition that it's raining in the form of A's wet umbrella and raincoat. So I'm going to develop a theory of rising declaratives in this talk. The general shape of the theory I want to pursue can be seen in 3 and 4. So what I'd like to have here is a theory of compositional semantics that provides the clausal meaning, and a theory of intonational meaning that provides the intonational meaning, and then those two things combine to produce the conventional meaning of an utterance. And then that conventional meaning is combined with the input context to produce the richer semantic pragmatic meaning. Notice here that I don't intend for the conventional meaning to include sentence type conventions or illocutionary force operators. I'm aiming to derive what we think of as assertions and questions from conventional meaning and context plus pragmatics. And I also aim to derive the special properties of rising declaratives. Okay, so those aims that I just outlined are made more complicated by the fact that rising declaratives can be split into 2 kinds. So there are inquisitive rising declaratives and assertive rising declaratives. I'm following the terminology of Zhang's taxonomy here, Zhang 2018. So the previous rain example is an example of an inquisitive rising declarative. It's used to ask a question, but it could have been either incredulous or confirmative, just depending on whether the speaker's amount of surprise at the evidence that it's raining. And the examples 5 and 6 distinguish those 2 kinds of inquisitive rising declaratives into incredulous and confirmative. So in 5, A says, John went to the airport to pick up his sister, and S says, John has a sister? So here S is surprised at the presupposition of A's utterance and uses the rising declarative to express that. You can compare that to 6, where there is no surprise. So S and A made plans 2 days ago to get drinks tonight. Today they haven't spoken about it since, and then S says, we're still on for tonight. So this is a confirmative rising declarative. So there are these 2 kinds of inquisitive rising declaratives. And then there are also these assertive rising declaratives. So an example in 7, A says, do you speak Spanish? And S says, I speak Ladino. Or in 8, A says, do you like Chinese food? And S says, I like orange chicken. So assertive rising declaratives are rising declaratives that the speaker uses to assert the propositional content of the declarative clause, but they nevertheless convey some kind of uncertainty or question. Okay. So here's what Farkash and Rolfson have to say about the inquisitive assertive split. They say, we assume for now that assertive rising declaratives are of a different nature than the ones we are concerned with, although ultimately we would of course like to better understand the connection between the different varieties and perhaps even come to a fully unified theory. So a fully unified theory is what I'm after. On the other hand, Zhang argues that inquisitive and assertive rising declaratives have different intonational contours, with the inquisitive ones rising more steeply than the assertive ones. The assertive ones have a shallower rise. If this is true, this suggests that there could be a principled reason for giving them distinct analyses. And then there would just be no need to unify, right? So you have 2 different contours, those 2 different contours contribute to the meaning in different ways, and out pops the inquisitive and assertive interpretations. Okay, so here are my main goals for today. The first is empirical. I want to demonstrate that it's not immediately obvious that inquisitive rising declaratives and assertive rising declaratives should be kept distinct. And the second goal is theoretical, to develop a unified account. And then along the way, I'm also going to discuss falling declaratives and polar interrogatives a bit. Okay, so the outline for the rest of the talk, I'm going to argue that linguistically there's only one relevant rise when we're talking about inquisitive and assertive rising declaratives. And then I'll offer my account and then conclude. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a minimal triple of rising declaratives. In these examples, all of them are about someone's rent being $999. That's an admittedly weird amount for a rent to be. I'm using that in particular because the number 999 has a lot of sonorants in it, which makes it easier for Prot to generate accurate pitch tracks. So in 9, suppose that a rent in the amount of $999 is surprising to S, either because that's high or low in S's market, whichever is easier to imagine. So then the speaker utters the inquisitive rising declarative incredulously. So S says, how much is the rent? And A says, $999. And S says, it's $999. It's $999. Okay, so that's the incredulous production. Compare that to the example in 10. So in 10, suppose that the speaker S is writing a rent check for his college student child A. This is only the second time that S has had to pay for A's rent. And he's looking for confirmation that it's $999. So S utters this inquisitive rising declarative confirmatively. So you can imagine in the context, S is standing there, pen in hand, hovering over his checkbook. He has this vague memory that the rent is $999, wants to double check and says, it's $999. It's $999. So you may have already noticed that compared to the incredulous version, the rise is less steep here. So again, the incredulous version is $999 versus the confirmative version, it's $999. Okay. And finally, we have an example of an assertive rising declarative in 11. So in this context, A works at a call center for a bank, and S has called to try to figure out whether he can pay his rent electronically. S is certain that the rent is $999. It's his own rent, after all. But A has said that they have this thing called Zelle Pay. It's like PayPal. And then A asked this question, how much is your rent? So from this, S is able to infer that Zelle Pay must have either an upper or a lower limit on payment amounts that is relevant to settling this larger question that's under discussion about figuring out how S can pay their rent electronically. And so then S uses the rising declarative to convey how much their rent is, but to suggest that they're uncertain about something else, about whether Zelle Pay will allow a payment of $999. So A says, we have Zelle Pay, it's like PayPal. How much is your rent? And S says, it's $999. It's $999. Okay. So on the meaning side, incredulous and confirmative rising declaratives pattern together, and that they share the following empirical generalizations about their meaning. So 1, the speaker makes no new commitments when they utter the rising declarative. 2, the speaker expects the addressee to answer as if it's a question. And 3, the speaker anticipates that the addressee will commit to the proposition P denoted by the declarative clause. And we can compare that to assertive rising declaratives. These have a different set of empirical generalizations about the meaning they contribute. So A, the speaker commits to P. B, the speaker does not necessarily expect the addressee to be committed to P, nor does the speaker expect the addressee to answer the rising declarative as if it were a question. And finally, the utterance of the rising declarative raises a second issue. So that's the meaning side. On the intonational side, and I already pointed to this earlier, the confirmative rising declarative is naturally produced with a shallower rise, making it intonationally more similar to the assertive rising declarative and not to the incredulous rising declarative. So we can see in the figure here, pitch tracks for my productions of these examples. In red is the pitch track for the incredulous rising declarative. So again, this is like shock at the amount of the rent. It's $999. Versus in blue, the pitch track for the confirmative rising declarative. So the speaker has got the pen in hand, hovering over a checkbook, has this vague memory that the rent is $999, wants to double check, and says, it's $999. It's $999. And so the second one, the confirmative rising declarative, patterns with the assertive rising declarative and having the shallower rise. whereas the incredulous rising declarative has a steeper rise. And the difference is really in the boundary tones. I'm actually not sure if you can see my cursor, but I imagine you probably can. So the boundary tones is the real difference here, and the Hertz levels are printed. So I think the intuition here is quite clear, and it can be replicated with any set of examples with rich enough context that to clearly distinguish the incredulous reading from the confirmative reading. The confirmative reading always patterns intonationally with the assertive reading, to the exclusion of the incredulous reading. Okay. Very briefly, I just want to point out that, like I said, the distinction is about the height of the final boundary tone, not the pitch accent. So I think all three of these kinds of rising declaratives with the two different intonational productions have the same nuclear contour, L star H dash H%. In previous literature, a lot of times people say the shallower rise is actually H star H dash H%. And I think if you go back to Pierre Humbert and Hirschberg's work and Pierre Humbert's dissertation, you can see that this is an odd fit for what we're seeing here, because the distinction between those two contours is in the height of the pitch accent, with the H star H dash H% production having a higher initial pitch accent. So I think what we're seeing instead is a paralinguistic difference in the height of the final boundary tone. Okay. So again, meaning-wise, the incredulous rising declarative and confirmative rising declarative pattern together to the exclusion of the assertive one, but intonationally we see a different pattern with confirmative and assertive patterning together to the exclusion of the incredulous one. And so the steepness of the final rise is not tracking the pragmatic inquisitive split of rising declaratives. We don't have time for this. Just briefly, I want to say that, it seems like the steepness of the rise is tracking incredulity. With the steeper the rise, the more incredulous it sounds. And I think this is because greater pitch excursions and higher boundary tones are a paralinguistic consequence of increased emotional activation. I have a little more I could say about this, but I don't have time in the context of the talk. Okay, so on to the unified account that I'm going to develop here. So here's an overview. I'm going to assume a model of context that builds on a lot of prior work, especially the Farkas and Bruce table model of discourse, building on Stolnik-Aryan common ground. I also assume Gricean pragmatics. For clause types, I'm assuming Hamlin semantics, where declarative clauses denote singleton sets of propositions. So a set containing a single set of worlds, whereas polar interrogatives denote sets of two propositions, the pre-adjacent and its complement. And for the intonation, I'm going to assume that rising intonation conveys uncertainty, while falling intonation conveys certainty. And I want to flag now that my approach owes much to previous work on rising declaratives, and will make use, well, I already mentioned making use of the table model. It's similar in spirit to both Dunlugson's and Rudin's approaches to rising declaratives, in that I want to assign simple meanings to both the clause type and the intonation, and then derive the various effects that we see. But unlike Dunlugson and Rudin, I don't want to set assertive rising declaratives aside for the intonational reasons I suggested before. The theory needs to be flexible enough to include them and make good on Farkas and Wolfson's hope for a unified account. Crucially, the way this is going to work is that the intonation, the meaning that the intonation conveys usually, but does not always, signal certainty or uncertainty about the content of the clause that it's appearing with. The intonation has to be able to sort of float free and target other meanings. And this idea can be traced to Bartels and Trickenbrode's work. Okay. So for the context C is a tuple. This tuple includes a set of individuals who are participants, interlocutors in the conversation, a set of discourse commitments for each of the interlocutors. There's a table, which is a push-down stack of issues, and each issue is a set of propositions. And then we have a common ground, a set of all the propositions that discourse participants are publicly committed to. A context set which can be derived from that common ground, the set of worlds compatible with all the propositions of common ground. And finally, I also assume a separate question or discussion separate from the table. This is a contextually salient question or goal. It does not need to be the top issue in the pushdown stack on the table. Okay, and again, a Hamlin semantics here, no surprises. And for intonation, what I want to say is intonation combines with a clause, since clause could be either declarative or a polar interrogative, and it returns the content of that clause, but it's defined only if the speaker is certain about a proposition. Well, so I'm talking here now about 17a, the following intonation is defined only if the speaker is certain about a proposition Q that must be true in order for the Q, U, D, and C to be settled after the present utterance. 17b, we have the meaning for rising intonation. These utterances are defined only if the speaker is uncertain about a proposition Q that must be true in order for the Q, U, D, and C to be settled after the present utterance. And I have a default assumption here, which is that this proposition Q is going to be identified with the content of the clause if nothing blocks it. The clause that's uttered with the intonation is the easiest thing to identify as the target of this certainty-uncertainty distinction. So it's only if there's some reason not to assume that we then go looking for some other meaning for that certainty-uncertainty distinction to combine with. Okay, I have here an utterance function, a very general one, which takes clauses and just puts their content on the table and does nothing more. Since it's so general, further effects that utterances have on context will need to be derived from clausal content and intonation. I make some assumptions about conversation that have been widely made. So conversations about building the common ground, shrinking the context set, and finding out what the world is like. The context set is built by adding issues to the table and then removing them by agreeing to commit to answers to them. But to commit to a proposition P, the interlocutor needs to believe P and have evidence for it, price and quality. Thus, given pressure to grow the common ground and the means by which it's done, utterances of declaratives and interrogatives have the following pragmatic effect. There's a pragmatic requirement of support for a proposition P in the issue. So when an issue I is added to the table, there's pressure for an interlocutor A to add a proposition P in the issue to their discourse commitments so that the other interlocutors can make dependent commitments, and then you can move on and achieve the goal of the conversation. So I want to derive the basic effects of asserting and questioning from this support requirement combined with clausal and intonational content. Okay, so let's talk about each of the key kinds of examples. So following declaratives. So the empirical facts we want to explain here are that the speaker commits to P. The speaker does not necessarily expect the addressee to be committed to P. The speaker does not expect the addressee to answer. So we have an example in 21. A says, how much is your rent? S says, is $9.99. The utterance adds this singleton set to the table. The support requirement applies pressure for an interlocutor to commit to that proposition in order to remove that issue from the table. And the following intonation requires that the speaker is certain about a proposition Q that must be true in order for the Q, U, D, and C to be settled after the present utterance. Q, U, D here being how much is your rent? So nothing here restricts Q from being identified with the propositional content P. It's the easiest one to identify, and so that's our default assumption. So the following declarative then conveys that the speaker is certain about P. And given the support requirement, we infer that the speaker supports P. The speaker wants to add it to their discourse commitments. And then if A agrees, makes a dependent commitment, then we can add P to the common ground and move on from that issue. Okay, I see that I'm just over 20 minutes, so I'm gonna hurry here, but I'll be done soon. So now empirical facts for polar interrogatives. The speaker makes no new commitments. The speaker expects the addressee to answer. So in 23 of an example, S says, is the rent $9.99? The utterance adds the set of propositions to the table. The support requirement applies pressure for an interlocutor to commit to either P or not P. And the rising intonation requires that the speaker is uncertain about a proposition Q that must be true in order for the QUD and C to be settled after the present utterance. So the rise signals that the speaker is uncertain about whether P or not P. And the rising polar interrogative then conveys that the speaker is not going to be the one to satisfy the support requirement by making a commitment. So given the pressure for someone to commit, we infer that the speaker intends for the addressee to make a commitment by providing an answer. Okay, and so for inquisitive rising declaratives, these have the same empirical facts to explain as polar interrogatives plus the one in 24C that the speaker anticipates the addressee will commit to the proposition P denoted by the declarative clause. So we have our example in 10 of someone writing the rent check for their child, and they say it's $9.99 to double check. The utterance adds that proposition to the table. Support requires that there's, so the support requirement applies pressure for an interlocutor to commit to P. And then the rise requires that the speaker is uncertain about a proposition Q that must be true in order for the QUD and C to be settled after the present utterance. Again, here there's nothing blocking that rise from targeting the propositional content of the rising declarative. So the rising declarative conveys the speaker will not be the one to satisfy the support requirement by making a commitment, and that applies pressure. Well, given the pressure, for someone to commit, we infer that the speaker intends for the addressee A to make a commitment by providing an answer. Okay, but what about this requirement that the speaker anticipates that the addressee will commit to that proposition? The reason for that, my explanation of this follows on both Vestra and Rudin's accounts by taking there to be competition with the polar interrogative. So the speaker uttered a clause that denotes a singleton set containing P, but signaled her own uncertainty about P. Support requires someone to commit to it. If the speaker didn't have prior reason to expect that A would commit to it, then they would have used the polar interrogative, which puts both P and not P on the table, providing the addressee with two possibilities to answer. Since the speaker didn't choose this polar interrogative, she must have reason to expect her addressee is going to be able to satisfy the support requirement for the only proposition in the topmost issue on the table, P. So this is where this expectation comes from. And finally, let's talk about assertive rising declaratives. So here, just like with following declaratives, the speaker commits to P and does not necessarily expect the addressee to be committed to P, nor does the speaker expect the addressee to answer. But the added empirical fact to explain here is that the utterance of the rising declarative raises a second issue. So we have this example where S is trying to pay rent electronically. A, who works at the bank, says we have Zelle Pay. It's like PayPal. How much is your rent? And S says it's $9.99. So the utterance adds singleton set P to the table. The support requirement applies pressure for an interlocutor to commit to P. And the rising intonation requires that S is uncertain about a proposition Q that must be true in order for the QUD and C to be settled after the present utterance. So unlike all of the prior examples, the rise here cannot signal that the speaker is uncertain about P. The inference that Q is equivalent to P here is made highly unlikely by the fact that the speaker knows much better than the addressee how much her rent is. And that in combination with the requirement for support for P leads us to infer that the speaker supports P and adds it to her discourse commitments. And so then S does not expect A to be committed to P, nor to answer the assertive rising declarative as if it were a question. And so what is Q here then? Well, remember in 11, the QUD is to find a way for the speaker to pay rent electronically. A has suggested Zelle Pay and asked a local question, the amount implying that the amount matters to whether Zelle Pay addresses the QUD. In order for the QUD to be settled after the speaker's utterance of P, the proposition that Zelle Pay enables payments of $9.99 must be true. Thus, this is the Q that S expresses uncertainty about, and whether it is true or not is the second issue raised by the assertive rising declarative. Okay, so I know I've run way over. I had two goals for today: to demonstrate that it's not unreasonable to think that inquisitive and assertive rising declaratives have the same intonation, and the second to develop a unified account that doesn't make use of conventions of use for individual sentence types or elocutionary operators. And I just stop there. I look forward to hearing any comments and questions you have. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel. We have about 4 minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Again, please use the chat function to indicate that you have a question, or type it out, or the Q&A function. Anyone? Sophia Malamud has a comment. Okay, Sophia, give me 2 seconds. I'm going to give you the power of speech again. Just a second. You should be able to speak now.
I think I got it.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. That was marvelous to hear. The unified account is something that's a dear goal to my heart. I really like one feature of your account, and that is the separation between the table and the QUD. I really think those should be kept distinct, and there are multiple places to look for evidence that they should be. I mean, the table really was originally intended as this sort of anaphoric antecedents kind of storage, right, for response particles, right? And so one place I've been looking for a way to distinguish is in the realm of imperatives, which for instance, even when the QUD is very clearly about, so I can ask, what should I do? And you can tell me, open the door, and I can say no. And that doesn't mean, no, I shouldn't open the door. It means, no, I won't open the door. Right? There's no way to make it right. And so that's the thing. The QUD is whether I should, but the issue on the table is whether I will. So that's just a comment.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's also a brief discussion in Rudin's thesis about keeping them distinct as well. So if I don't know if you've already seen that, but that's another place to look for some arguments along those lines.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I see a question in the Q&A, so I'll just read it out. It's from Angelica Kiss. As far as I know, final rises, according to Gussenhoven, do not necessarily indicate quote-unquote uncertainty, but the wider notion of non-finality. If one's positively surprised by the fact that the rand is $9.99, that's the end of the sentence. This would not convey uncertainty. It would be an echoic declarative question in Poshman's terminology. Yet I expect them to pronounce the RD with HT prize. I don't see a question mark here. I guess it was a comment. Would you like to respond to that, Daniel?
Thanks. That's a helpful comment. Yes, it's definitely true that, I mean, Gussenhoven talks about non-finality as well as uncertainty. So for the frequency code, he talks about uncertainty, and for the effort code, I believe he talks about non-finality. And he suggests that maybe they could be unified along the lines you're discussing. I mean, I kind of want to say that in the incredulity case, that the speaker is expressing uncertainty about that proposition before they're then going on to accept it. But I think that it's a great point, and it's definitely something that I should think about more. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel. That's all time we have. Our third and last talk in this session is by Maura Maldonado and Jennifer Culbertson. Both are from University of Edinburgh. Maura is here with us, and the topic is markedness and learnability of response particles. Maura, we can see your screen, we can see your slides, so the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay, so today we are going to talk about learnability of response particles. So let me just read. So cross-linguistically, response to assertions and questions often involve what we call response particles. So for example, in English, the particles yes and no can be used in response to assertions like Sam is home or Sam is not home, as we can see in the examples in the slide. So in this presentation, we will adopt the perspective of a group of theories which have captured or tried to capture the within and across language variation in response particles by proposing two basic semantic features. So this is a group of theories that we could consider feature-based theories. So the first feature that has been proposed indicates whether the polarity of the response itself is negative or positive. So basically, a response particle is going to be marked as plus if it appears in a response with positive polarity, and as minus if it appears in a response with negative polarity. Now, the second feature is going to indicate whether the response agrees or disagrees with the previous assertion. So it's basically going to serve to make a connection with a previous discourse. So depending on the case, we will have response particles that are marked as yes, as agree if they agree with the previous discourse, or as reverse if they disagree with the previous discourse. So languages differ both in the number of particles, response particles that they have, and in what features those particles can express. So for example, in English, the particle yes has been claimed to express both the feature agree and the feature plus independently, whereas the particle no has been claimed to express the feature reverse and the feature minus. Because of this independent characterization of these particles, we can account for the fact that in situations like agree plus situations, where we need to agree with a previous assertion with a positive polarity response, the only option that we have in English is to use the response particle yes, whereas in reverse minus situations, the only option that we have is to use the particle no. Now, because of the way we have characterized the particles in English, we will have also situations in which both particles are available. So for example, when we want to disagree with a previous assertion, by using a positive polarity response. So this is in cases in which we have a reverse plus context. We will have the option in English to use either the particle yes or the particle no. And the same will happen in principle in agree minus situations. Now, of course, speakers will have different preference patterns regarding which of these two particles, yes or no, they want to use in these cases. And there is a lot of experimental work trying to tap into these preference patterns, but we are not going to discuss this work today. So for the rest of the talk, we are going to represent systems of response particles in tables like the one we have here, where we have the two possible feature specifications and the particles that are used to express each of these feature specifications without including the remainder of the response, so without including the continuation of the response. So what we have seen so far for English is that these response particles are used to express individual features, like agree or plus or reverse or minus. But in principle, we can also have particles that express feature combinations. So we are going to call these particles that express feature combinations specialized particles. And these would basically be particles that are used to express one particular cell in the kind of table that we are using here. Now, an example of a language that has such a specialized particle is German. So in German, we have a particle ja, which is similar to English yes, in that it's used for agree and for plus meanings. A particle nein, which is used for reverse and minus in the same way that English no. And a third particle, doch, which is a specialized particle that is used specifically to express reverse plus meaning. So this particle is used in situations in which we want to disagree with a previous assertion by using a positive polarity response. So something similar to this also happens in French with the particle si, although maybe the description is not exactly the same. Now, the use of doch, or the availability of a particle, a specialized particle like doch, is going to basically block the use of ja or nein in these kind of scenarios. Now, we have seen so far, by looking at German and in English, that languages can vary a little bit in how many particles they have and how they map features or meanings into these particles. Besides this variation, or on top of this variation, we would like to see whether there is some general constraint on how languages express these features. And indeed, in recent work, Rulofsen and Farkas have posited that possible systems of response particles are constrained by a markedness hierarchy of meaning, such that some meaning combinations are more marked than others. And in particular, well, the hierarchy is over here, so the most marked meaning is a meaning, a reverse plus meaning, and the least marked one is an agree plus. So very briefly, the reasoning behind this hierarchy is the idea that agree and plus as features form a natural class, as do reverse and minus. So meanings that do not involve natural classes, like these two sets of meanings, are more marked than meanings that do involve natural classes. And on top of that, we also have a difference and asymmetry between reverse and agree in terms of which of these two meanings is more marked, with reverse being more marked than agree. So this markedness hierarchy is meant to determine how meanings are mapped to forms cross-linguistically. In particular, this hierarchy is served to derive a prediction regarding how specialized particles are used. So the idea is that these specialized particles, which are used to express feature combinations, are going to be more likely to appear for more marked meanings like reverse plus. And this is actually what we saw in German. So here today, what we are going to show you is how we can try to test this prediction by using a series of artificial language learning experiments. So in order to do this, we derive what we call a corollary prediction, which is a prediction derived from this main prediction by Rulofsen and Farkas. So this corollary prediction is going to be expressed by saying that formally marked particles, which are longer or complex, are mapped into more marked meanings. And this is actually based on the very general idea there is a tight relation in language between markedness of form and markedness of meaning. And this prediction is basically translating the idea of a specialized particle into the idea that this particle is going to be somehow longer or more complex. And we are going to start by testing this prediction, this corollary prediction, by using what is known as a regularization paradigm. So in this kind of design, learners are exposed to a system with free variation, and learning difficulty is assessed by exploring the degree to which that variation is regularized. So in experiment 1, learners were trained on assertion response pairs. So we use English for everything but a set of 3 novel particles. So basically we had a particle niche, which was used for a minus meaning, so for responses that had negative polarity, and a particle va and a particle vadov, which were used in half and half, so with varying frequency, for agree plus meanings and for reverse plus meanings. So we can see here that this input is has random variation. So according to the hierarchy of meaning proposed, what we predict is that because reverse plus over here is more marked than agree plus, then participants will condition this random variation between va and vadov such that the short form va is going to be used for agree plus meanings, whereas the longer form vadov is going to be used for reverse plus situations. Now, let me just give you an example of how the experiment looks like. So participants during training are presented with these pairs of shapes, colored shapes, right? So, and they will see one speaker which makes a statement. Oh, let me, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay, so I was saying that participants are exposed to these pairs of shapes, color shapes, and they are presented with one speaker, which makes a statement, such as the circle is blue, and an answer that a speaker V makes using this new response particle. So in this case, because we are in an agree plus situation, the speaker V is going to use the particle va or the particle vadov, depending half and half of the time. And then participants are going to have to recall the new particle that they have seen. And we are going to basically have exactly the same training for agree minus situations, where the speaker V is going to use the particle niche. For reverse minus situations, where the speaker V is going to use the form niche as well, and for reverse plus situations, where once again the speaker V is going to use half of the time the particle va and half of the time the particle vadov. Now, during testing, participants are going to be asked to produce these response particles by producing the response that the speaker V should be given. So in this case, we have an agree plus situation, so speaker V could answer va, it is, or vadov, it is. Now, we ran this experiment on Mechanical Turk online, and we quantified the proportion of times that participants were using the shorter form, va, for each of the two critical meanings, so for agree plus situations and for reverse plus situations. And this is what we have, what we obtain. So this plot shows the individual participant and the average use of the short form va. And what we find is that participants use the short form more for less marked meanings like agree plus, and less for more marked meanings like reverse plus. Okay, so this is the statistics. Now, this is what we predicted. And in a second experiment, we try to continue this by testing a different set of critical meanings. So in this case, we are going to test agree minus and agree plus. So in this second experiment, we have a particle niche, which is going to be used for disagreeing responses. So in this case, for reverse meanings. And then we will have the variation between va and vadov appearing for agree plus meanings and for agree minus meanings. And what we predict, given this hierarchy over here, is that people should use more often the particle va for agree plus meanings and the longer particle vadov for agree minus meanings. And this is what we have. Once again, the plot shows an individual participant and average use of the short form va. Okay, and what we see is that participants use the short form va more often, significantly more often, for the less marked meaning agree plus than for the agree minus meaning, which is more marked, as we predicted. Now, in a third experiment, we decided to test a final set of critical meanings, which are reverse plus and reverse minus. And the idea behind running this third experiment was to test an alternative explanation for our results in the previous two experiments, namely that there is something special about agree plus. So in the previous two experiments, we were testing agree plus versus something else. And it could be that actually what we are looking at is a preference that learners have to use a shorter form for this least marked meaning. So now we are going to change that, and we are going to make a comparison between reverse plus and reverse minus. So because we are making this change, we are also changing a little bit the particles. So we are going to use the particle yesh for responses that have positive polarity, so for plus meanings. And we are going to have a variation, random variation between va and vadov for reverse minus and reverse plus meanings. And what we would expect is that participants should use more often the particle va for reverse minus meanings and the particle vadov for reverse plus meanings, just as before. So we run this experiment online, once again, using Mechanical Turk with a different set of participants. And in this case, so here we have the results. I mean, these results show exactly the same as in the previous experiments. But in this case, what we find is that participants do not condition short form use on meaning. So they don't use the short form more for less marked reverse minus meanings. Okay, so here we have the difference between these two conditions is not statistically significant. So interestingly, something that we should point out about this third experiment is that participants were much worse at learning the system. So I can talk about this in the question period, but so we had some exclusion criteria that we were using to be sure that participants were actually learning the system. And the results that I'm showing you is the results are the results after exclusions. So as you can see, if you have been paying attention to the number of participants in each experiment, here we have a much lower number. And this lower number comes from the fact that we had to exclude more people because people were having a lot of trouble learning the system in itself. Okay, so in these three experiments, we evaluated whether learners would condition random variation in particle complexity, here cash out as length, on meaning markedness according to the hierarchy proposed. And what we found is that in some cases they do. So in particular, they do map the shorter form to the least marked meaning when this least marked meaning is agree plus, but not when it's reverse minus. And so it's important to maybe note that this effect cannot be explained by saying that learners like to assign the long form to the more marked meaning, because actually in the last experiment, we found that they don't do that for the most marked meaning, which is reverse plus. So what this suggests is that it's not clear that people are conditioning the form of the particle by the markedness differential between critical meanings. So there are two obvious explanations of why we might be failing to find this effect, these predicted effects. So the first is that the specific link that we are proposing in our corollary hypothesis between markedness in meaning and markedness in form is not right. So maybe the way in which markedness meaning is expressed is not by having longer or more complex particles. And the second possibility is that hierarchy itself is not representing what learners do, or the way in which learners conceive these response particles. So what we did was a fourth experiment designed to test the first possibility, designed to basically change our corollary hypothesis. So instead of manipulating length, in this fourth experiment, we manipulate whether the system has a particle which is specialized in that is clearly different from the particles available in English. So in this case, we use ease of learning design, where we test just how well participants learned a given system. So we have basically, we teach participants one of two possible systems. So one system, both of the systems use NICs for negative polarity responses, so for minus responses. And we use NICs to make the particles similar to English no or not. And both systems have a particle yes, which is similar to English yes, to express one of the two possible positive polarity responses. And then the difference between the systems is this specialized particle fab, which in the first of the systems is used for reverse plus meanings, and this makes the system closer to Sherman. And in the second system is used for agree plus meanings, which are the least marked of the meanings in the hierarchy. So what we predict then, following the hierarchy, is that people should be worse at learning a system that has a specialized particle for the least marked meaning, so a system that has fab as the particle for agree plus, than learning a system that has fab for the most marked meaning. And at this point, let me note that there is something very important, which is part of our second corollary prediction, and is the idea that people are going to notice that the particle fab is somehow special in some sense. So it's somehow different from yes and ich. And this is something that is not obvious. So this is an assumption that we are making. Okay, so we run this experiment online, and in this case, we are measuring the proportion of correct responses in the trials in which participants had to use the particle fab. So we had the two groups, the groups in which the particle fab was used for agree plus, and the groups in which the particle fab was used for reverse plus. And this is what we find. So here, what we see is that there is no significant difference between the two conditions. And if anything, the numerical trend goes in the wrong direction. So people find harder a system like Sherman, let's call it. So a system that has a specialized or marked particle for the reverse plus. And this is surprising because this experiment is actually quite similar to our first experiment, in which we did find that people condition length of the particle to mark the difference between agree plus and reverse plus. Okay, so in this fourth experiment, we attempted a different way of testing rule of Zen and Farkas hypothesis using eyes of learning design. So we taught participants one of two possible particle systems in which either the most or the least marked meaning were associated with a marked particle. And we found no learning disadvantage for systems with a marked particle for agree plus. And this could be due to the fact that the particle fab is not treated as specialized by learners, or because actually this system with a specialized particle for agree plus is possible to learn. Now, in any case, it's worth noticing that in this experiment, participants were not very successful at learning the critical particles in either condition, and the distribution was highly bimodal, in the sense that some participants learned perfectly, and some participants learned rather badly, and in a way that was predicted by English. So for example, they would use consistently the particle yes for agree plus, or the particle yes or nix for reverse plus. So it's possible that if we had used a different set of particles, which is not English-like, or if participants were trained longer, we might have seen the predicted difference emerge. Okay, so just to conclude, we have seen that previous work has claimed that two features, plus, minus, and agree reverse, are relevant for capturing cross-linguistic variation in response particles. In recent work, Wolfons and Farkas have argued that cross-linguistic variation is constrained such that specialized particles expressing combinations of features should be expressed by more marked particles, or by specialized particles. So we should expect specialized particles for reverse plus and not for agree plus. So here we tested this prediction by using two different artificial language learning designs, one looking at whether the participants condition variation in particle length on meaning markedness, and the other one looking at whether ease of learning of the systems depend on whether the specialized particle is there for the most or for the least marked meaning. Across these experiments, we found no clear evidence that meaning markedness played a role. That being said, these experiments are the first ones evaluating this hypothesis, and there is a lot of experimental and typological work to do to improve. Thanks.
Thank you, Maura. We have about 7 minutes for the Q&A. I see something in the Q&A function. Okay, we have a question from anonymous attendee in the Q&A. I'm going to read it. Thank you. A question about design. It seems that the non-target nonce particles all bear some sort of phonetic similarity to the actual English particles yes and no. Is that intentional? Would that not bias participants' hypothesis space by prompting them to apply analogy as a specific learning strategy? Thank you for the question. I have the same question. So, Laura?
Okay. Yes, so that was intentional. And the reason so in the first 3 experiments that I showed, this is a regularization paradigm. So basically what we are interested in is just looking at the trials in which people had varying random variation, like varying input. So those trials do not include particles that are similar to English, because this is va versus va-dov. And so the reason why the other particles, so the particle niche and the particle yesh, were actually selected to make them similar to English was to make the experiment easier. basically, because like if participants are just working by analogy, I mean, there is no way in which participants can choose a regularization strategy between va and vadov by analogy with English, because in English, participants would just use maybe the same form for agree plus situations and for reverse minus. So this is for the regularization part. So it's just to make it slightly easier. And for the ease of learning part, so for the last experiment, I mean, that's a great question. So we did do it intentionally. So we actually tried to exploit the fact that nig, and let me maybe go to the, exploit the fact that these two particles were similar to no or not, and this particle yes was similar somehow to yes. So we try to exploit the difference between these three and fab in order to make fab more salient. And clearly this didn't work. I mean, so it could be that people are actually learning the system by analogy with English, and that's why they try, in these cases, they are bad at learning this particle, and they try in these cases to use yes and nig because they think they are learning like a weird English, right? And so the next step for us is to basically try to run a similar design, but with particles that are all of them very different from the particles in English. But the thing is that, well, we need to choose how we represent this fab particle in order to make it special with respect to the rest. I don't know if that answers both, like the questions of both of you.
I think it does for me. I don't know about the anonymous attendee, but they can follow up. Anyway, are there any other questions? I don't see anything in the chat. Daniel, you have a question? I guess you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hi, Maura.
Hi.
Great talk. I think it's so, just because no one else asked one, I think you mentioned something about issues in maybe experiment 3 with participants having some trouble learning the system. And I think you said something like you could talk further about that. What happened there?
So there are like two different aspects of it. So the first aspect is in one of the experiments. So basically in the regularization experiment, in this one. So the way this works is we first teach people, we expose people to the particles, and then we test them. And we have a very high accuracy threshold to include participants in the experiment. So we need people to actually learn the particles, to use yes and nig or vadov or ba, and not use other things, right? Especially because it's a production task. So in this experiment, what happened was that people were not learning the particles correctly. So that actually maybe suggests that even if we try to make the particle yes similar to English, people were not really encoding it as similar to English. They were having like, they were using, I mean, that can include just typos, or can include like, it's not very regular, the kind of errors that people make. But in this experiment, it's just that there were, like, we ran 6 participants, I think, and we had to exclude nearly 40. Or so it's like a very high exclusion rate that included all kinds of errors. And then in the, like, maybe a little bit more interesting is what happens in the last experiment. So in this experiment, we were actually testing how well people learn. And what we find, so here I'm showing you the results just for this particle fab, but you don't actually see what are the options that people, what are the things that people put. And what we find in this particular case is that people kind of resist the particle fab. So they don't use it. Instead of using fab, they use yes, or so the other particles. Basically, they try to do English. So they try to just use for this cell or for this cell the particle, these two particles that they have over here. And this is interesting because it suggests that actually we were right in trying to make this similar to English, but we were wrong in making them so similar that people cannot really learn the new particle. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Corey. Unfortunately, we do not have time for another question. That's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the speakers. Thank you, the attendees. As I said before, we're going to close the Zoom room now, but it will reopen for the next session, okay? So unless there are any other things that we need to address, Ken, are we good?
No, that's perfect. Thank you, everyone, for
Thank
attending.
you.
We'll see you in the next one.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy
Thank
the rest of
you.
your conference.
Bye.